The office sat high above Manhattan, wrapped in walls of glass that turned the entire city into a moving painting of lights. From this height, the streets looked calm, almost peaceful, but Emma Hartwell knew better. Beneath those glowing avenues flowed the invisible networks of power, money, and secrets that shaped the city. Most of those invisible networks existed because of her. Emma stood near the window with her hands resting lightly on the cool glass, watching the last gold streaks of sunset disappear behind the towers of Midtown. The reflection staring back at her looked composed and elegant. Auburn hair pulled neatly into a twist, dark tailored suit, calm expression. No one who saw that reflection would guess how much control she truly held. Everyone believed Brandon Coletti ran the empire. The newspapers called him the King of Manhattan. His face appeared in glossy magazines beside articles about luxury hotels, shipping companies, and international investments. To the world, he was a charismatic businessman, but the truth lived in spreadsheets and encrypted ledgers. Emma had written the algorithms that disguised billions moving through shell corporations. She had designed the shipping routes that allowed the syndicates, cargo to move quietly through ports across 3 continents. She had built the financial maze that made the Coletti syndicate untouchable. The empire looked like Brandon's, but it ran on Emma's mind. Behind her, the office door opened with a quiet click. Emma didn't turn right away. She already knew the sound of his footsteps. Brandon Coletti moved through rooms like he owned gravity itself. Tall, confident, perfectly dressed. His dark suit fit him like it had been carved onto his body, and his presence filled spaces long before he spoke. He stopped a few steps behind her. "Beautiful view," he said smoothly. Emma turned, offering a soft smile. The city always looks calm from above. Brandon glanced out the window, then back at her. His ice blue eyes held the confident charm that had once drawn her in completely. "We built all of this," he said. Emma said nothing. She had learned long ago that Brandon enjoyed believing that. 5 years earlier, they had stood in a much smaller office together, dreaming about building an empire. Back then, they had truly been partners. Now things were different. Emma walked back to her desk where several documents lay neatly arranged. "I finished the new routing model," she said. "If we shift shipments through Lisbon and reroute the Panama transfers, we can cut exposure by 40%. Brandon gave a brief nod, already distracted. "Send it to Marco. He'll handle the logistics." Emma studied him quietly. Marco would not understand half the complexity in the model, but Brandon never bothered with details anymore. He preferred the spotlight, the meetings, the cameras, the power. Emma returned to her work without comment, because someone still needed to keep the machine running. Later that night, the council chamber filled slowly with the most powerful figures inside the syndicate. The long mahogany table stretched across the center of the room like a battlefield line. Capos from New York, Chicago, Miami, and overseas operations took their seats, speaking in low voices. Emma entered quietly, taking the chair beside Brandon at the head of the table. Some of the older capos nodded respectfully when they saw her. They knew exactly who kept the empire stable. Numbers never lied, and Emma understood numbers better than anyone. The doors closed. The meeting began. Brandon spoke confidently about expansion opportunities, international partnerships, and new revenue streams. His voice carried easily across the room, practiced and commanding. Emma listened in silence until the doors opened again. A woman stepped inside. She was younger than Emma expected, perhaps 26, tall, blonde, and sharply dressed in a red suit that looked deliberately chosen to command attention. Her posture was confident, too confident for someone entering this room for the first time. Brandon's voice shifted slightly, almost pleased. "Gentlemen," he said, gesturing toward the woman, "I'd like to introduce Natalia Rossi." Natalia moved forward with a calm smile that never quite reached her eyes. "She'll be joining our executive team." Emma watched her carefully. There was something about the way Natalia looked around the room, not with nervous curiosity, but with quiet calculation, as if she were already measuring where everyone stood in the hierarchy. Natalia's gaze briefly met Emma's, for just a second, and in that moment Emma felt it. Not fear, not admiration, competition. Natalia turned her attention back to Brandon and rested her hand lightly on the back of his chair, leaning slightly toward him as if the position belonged to her. Emma felt a subtle tightening in her chest. Something small, something quiet, but unmistakable. For years Emma had understood every movement inside the syndicate, every alliance, every threat, every shift in loyalty. And now, watching Natalia Rossi smile across the council table, Emma realized something had entered the system she hadn't accounted for. A new variable. And variables had consequences. The meeting continued, voices rising and falling as business was discussed. But Emma barely heard the conversation, because for the first time in years, the machine she built no longer felt perfectly balanced. Somewhere deep within the Empire's carefully designed structure, the first crack had just appeared. The change began quietly, almost invisibly, like a shadow stretching slowly across a room before anyone notices the light fading. In the days following the council meeting, Natalia Rossi moved through the Coletti Syndicate headquarters as if she had always belonged there. At first it seemed harmless. Brandon introduced her to the department heads, gave her access to several operational briefings, and assigned her a position inside the Strategic Analysis Division. None of that, on its own, was unusual. The syndicate frequently recruited ambitious talent, but Emma Hartwell understood patterns, and patterns never lied. Natalia was appearing everywhere. In meetings that Emma had once attended alone, in discussions about routes, investments, and risk calculations. She would sit beside Brandon, leaning forward with attentive curiosity, listening carefully as if she were absorbing the rhythm of the Empire. But what unsettled Emma was not Natalia's presence. It was the way Brandon reacted to it. He seemed energized in a way Emma had not seen in years, laughing more easily, speaking louder, allowing Natalia to finish his sentences as if they had been working together for months instead of days. One afternoon, Emma stepped into the executive strategy room and paused when she heard Natalia presenting a financial idea to a group of senior captains. The room fell quiet as Emma entered, but the words Natalia had spoken lingered in the air like a familiar melody. Emma recognized them instantly. The strategy Natalia was explaining an offshore rebalancing model designed to conceal multi-million-dollar transfers through energy investment fronts was not just similar to Emma's work. It was Emma's work. Emma had designed that model 6 months earlier. She had written the formulas herself and hidden the structure inside the syndicate's encrypted database. Yet, Natalia spoke about it confidently, as if she had built it from nothing, describing the risk adjustments and revenue projections with enough accuracy to convince anyone who did not know the truth. Brandon stood beside her with a proud smile, nodding as if he were watching a star student impress her teachers. Emma remained perfectly still near the doorway, her expression calm, her posture relaxed, but something cold and sharp had begun forming inside her chest. She waited until the room cleared before speaking. When the last of the capos left, Emma turned to Brandon and asked quietly when Natalia had learned about the Lisbon transfer structure. Brandon's smile faded slightly, though irritation replaced it almost immediately. He told Emma that Natalia was extremely capable and that fresh perspectives were good for the organization. Emma replied that fresh perspectives were different from repeating private strategies she had developed herself. Brandon's expression hardened in a way Emma had never seen directed at her before. He told her she was overreacting. He said Natalia had been helping him review several strategic reports and had simply expanded on ideas they had discussed together. The dismissal struck Emma like a sudden gust of icy wind. For years she had trusted Brandon completely. They had built the empire together, each of them playing their role. Emma built the system. Brandon led the people, but standing there in the quiet office with the city glowing outside the windows, Emma felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Doubt. Later that evening, she sat alone in her office, reviewing the syndicate's encrypted logs, studying the access history for several sensitive financial files. Natalia's credentials had been granted deeper permissions than any analyst should ever have. Brandon had personally authorized the access. Emma stared at the screen for several minutes as the pieces slowly aligned inside her mind like numbers settling into a final equation. The system she had designed was still running perfectly. Every route, every account, every calculation remained intact. But someone new had stepped inside the machine. And if Emma had learned anything from years of building financial empires, it was this: the most dangerous threats were never the ones attacking from outside. They were the ones quietly rewriting the rules from within. For several weeks, Emma tried to convince herself that the growing unease in her chest was nothing more than stress. The syndicate was expanding rapidly, new alliances were forming overseas, and the financial web she maintained had grown so complex that even the smallest miscalculation could ripple across continents. It would have been easy to blame the tension on work alone, but Emma understood the language of instinct, and her instincts had never been wrong before. Something inside the empire had shifted. Natalia Rossi was no longer simply appearing in meetings. She was becoming part of them. She sat beside Brandon during negotiations, whispered observations into his ear while capos debated shipments and investments, and occasionally offered suggestions that Brandon praised publicly with surprising enthusiasm. Each time Emma heard Natalia speak, she felt the faint sting of recognition. The ideas sounded familiar, the structures too precise, the risk calculations shaped by the exact logic Emma herself had spent years developing. It was like listening to an echo of her own thoughts, distorted slightly but unmistakably hers. Brandon insisted it was coincidence. He said Natalia was talented, intuitive, ambitious, but Emma knew the difference between intuition and imitation. One cold morning in early autumn, Emma woke before sunrise with a strange wave of dizziness that forced her to sit down on the edge of the bed. For a moment she thought she might faint. The room felt warmer than it should have, and a quiet nausea lingered in her stomach long after the sensation passed. She dressed carefully and drove to a private medical clinic in Midtown without telling anyone, telling herself it was probably exhaustion. The doctor's office was calm and quiet, decorated with soft grey walls and framed photographs of peaceful landscapes that felt strangely distant from the world Emma normally lived in. When the doctor returned with the results, her expression carried a gentle warmth that Emma immediately recognized as significant. The words arrived softly, but they changed everything. Emma was pregnant, 6 weeks along. For several minutes, Emma simply sat there, her hands folded together in her lap, while the realization settled slowly into place. She had imagined this moment before, during quieter times in her marriage, when she and Brandon still spoke about the future with genuine excitement. They had once planned to start a family after the syndicate stabilized. After the empire reached a level of security they had always worked toward. Now that moment had arrived in a way neither of them expected. As Emma drove back toward Manhattan, sunlight spilling across the river and reflecting off the steel towers of the city, a quiet warmth spread through her chest. The empire suddenly felt less important than it had only hours earlier. For the first time in years, the endless calculations and negotiations of the syndicate seemed secondary to something far more meaningful. She was going to be a mother. Emma decided she would tell Brandon that evening. She chose one of their favorite restaurants, a quiet Italian place in the West Village, where they had celebrated their anniversary during the early years of their marriage. The restaurant held memories of laughter and long conversations about dreams that once felt simple and pure. Emma arrived early, wearing a deep blue dress Brandon had always liked, her hand resting unconsciously over her stomach as if protecting the fragile life growing there. When Brandon finally entered the restaurant, Emma felt her heart lift briefly with relief. But the feeling vanished almost immediately when she realized he was not alone. Natalia Rossi stepped through the doorway beside him, her hand resting lightly on Brandon's arm, as if the gesture were completely natural. Brandon introduced her casually, explaining that Natalia had been working closely with him on several strategic operations and that it would be useful to discuss certain matters over dinner. Emma forced a polite smile, though the words she had planned to say seemed to dissolve somewhere in her throat. Throughout the evening, Natalia spoke confidently about new expansion opportunities, occasionally touching Brandon's sleeve while laughing at his remarks in a way that felt far too familiar. Emma watched quietly, noticing every small detail. The way Brandon leaned slightly closer to Natalia while she spoke. The way Natalia glanced at Emma occasionally with a look that was polite on the surface but sharp underneath. By the time the dinner ended, the warmth Emma had felt earlier that day had cooled into something far more complicated. Driving home through the dim glow of Manhattan's midnight streets, Emma rested one hand against her stomach and stared out through the windshield at the endless grid of lights. She still had not told Brandon about the baby, and somewhere deep inside her mind, a quiet voice had begun whispering that the moment might never come. The night of the council presentation arrived, with the heavy atmosphere of something inevitable, like a storm gathering far beyond the horizon while the city below continued its ordinary rhythm. The grand conference hall of the Coletti Syndicate headquarters had been transformed into a theater of power. The long walls were lined with dark polished wood, and enormous windows framed the glittering skyline of Manhattan as if the city itself had been summoned to witness what would unfold. Emma Hartwell arrived early, her heels echoing softly across the marble floor as she walked toward the stage. For months she had worked relentlessly on the project she would unveil that night, a revolutionary financial structure designed to expand the syndicate's global operations while hiding its movement of wealth so deeply within legitimate markets that even the most aggressive investigators would see nothing but normal economic activity. It was her masterpiece, the culmination of years of mathematical insight and relentless discipline. She had barely slept during the final weeks of preparation, refining each algorithm until the system moved with flawless precision. Beneath the fitted black blazer she wore, the subtle curve of her stomach was just beginning to show, though most people would never notice. Emma had spent the afternoon rehearsing the words she would say when the presentation ended. Tonight, she would finally tell Brandon about the child growing inside her, the new life that had quietly begun while everything else around them felt uncertain. In her mind, she imagined his expression softening with surprise and pride, imagined the possibility that the distance growing between them might dissolve in the face of something so real. But when Emma stepped through the large double doors of the auditorium, the vision shattered before she could take another breath. Brandon was already standing on the stage. Beside him stood Natalia Rossi, poised and radiant in a red suit that seemed chosen deliberately to command attention. The massive projection screen behind them displayed the title of Emma's presentation. The first slide of the algorithm she had spent months designing glowed across the wall in crisp white text and graphs that Emma knew as intimately as her own handwriting. For a moment she could not move. The quiet murmur of voices from the assembled council members seemed to fade into a distant blur as Emma stared at the screen, trying to understand what she was seeing. Brandon's voice carried through the room with confident authority as he began speaking. He welcomed the international representatives, praised the syndicate's recent expansion, and then introduced the new system that would transform the empire's financial structure. But when he spoke about its creators, he did not say Emma's name. Instead, he gestured toward Natalia with unmistakable pride and described her as the brilliant strategist responsible for developing the model. Emma felt the cold realization spread through her body like ice cracking across a frozen lake. Every formula displayed on the screen was hers. Every projection and coded layer had been built with her own hands. Yet the room filled with applause for Natalia as Brandon continued describing the system as if it had emerged entirely from their collaboration. Emma began walking forward before she fully realized she had decided to move. Each step echoed through the silent hall as the audience gradually turned toward her. Brandon paused mid-sentence when he saw her approaching the stage, his confident smile tightening slightly with irritation. Emma climbed the steps slowly, her pulse steady despite the storm raging inside her chest. When she reached the center of the stage, she faced the crowd of men who had trusted her judgment for years and spoke clearly enough for every person in the room to hear. She said the system belonged to her. She said she had written every line of code and designed every layer of the financial structure. The silence that followed felt enormous. Brandon's expression changed from irritation to something colder, something calculating. He stepped closer and placed a hand lightly on Natalia's shoulder, as if reinforcing his version of the story. Then he turned back to the council and spoke in a tone that sounded almost sympathetic. He suggested Emma had been under a great deal of pressure lately, and that perhaps she was confused about the details of the project. Emma felt the weight of hundreds of eyes watching her, measuring her, judging the credibility of what she was saying. The betrayal itself hurt, but what followed cut even deeper. Brandon asked security to escort Emma from the room, explaining calmly that she was no longer involved in the syndicate's leadership. As the guards approached, Emma's desperation surged past her restraint. The words escaped before she could stop them. She told Brandon she was pregnant. The revelation hung in the air like a suspended breath. For a brief second, Emma believed the shock might break through his composure, might remind him of the life they had once built together. But Brandon's face hardened instead. He told her the child was her responsibility now, not his, and that she was no longer part of the Coletti empire. Moments later, the guards were guiding her through the doors and out into the cold night air of Manhattan, leaving behind the empire she had built while the applause inside the hall resumed for the woman who had stolen it. The cold air outside the Coletti Syndicate headquarters felt unreal against Emma's skin, as if the world had suddenly become sharper, louder, and far less forgiving. For several minutes, she simply stood on the sidewalk beneath the towering building she had helped design, watching the revolving doors spin as employees moved in and out without noticing her. The city continued its relentless rhythm around her. Taxi horns echoed down the avenue, neon lights flickered to life, and crowds of strangers hurried past without understanding that an empire had just collapsed inside one woman's chest. Emma wrapped her coat tighter around herself and forced her legs to move. Standing there would not change what had happened. Brandon had not simply betrayed her. He had erased her. Every access code she possessed had already been revoked by the time she tried to log into the financial system from her phone. Her joint accounts with Brandon had been frozen within hours. A quiet but devastating reminder that the man she once trusted had planned this far longer than she realized. By the time Emma reached the small hotel room she had rented in Queens late that night, the truth had become painfully clear. The life she had built was gone. The company she had created no longer recognized her existence. The days that followed blurred together into a strange mixture of exhaustion and determination. Emma survived quietly in the anonymous corners of the city, avoiding the places where the Coletti Syndicate's influence stretched too far. She spent hours walking through neighborhoods where no one knew her name, studying the crowds and listening to the endless movement of the city that had once felt like her kingdom. At night she returned to the cramped hotel room with its faded carpet and humming air conditioner, spreading papers across the small desk, while her mind continued to calculate possibilities. She had always solved problems by breaking them into numbers, patterns, and strategies. But this problem was different. Brandon had stripped away her resources, her protection, and her position inside the empire. The only thing he had failed to take was the knowledge inside her mind. Emma understood the structure of the syndicate better than anyone alive. She knew where its money flowed, where its secrets were hidden, and where the weaknesses lay buried beneath years of careful expansion. Yet knowledge alone could not rebuild her life. She needed power, and power required allies. On the 8th morning after her exile, Emma woke before dawn with the quiet certainty that the moment for hesitation had passed. The decision waiting in front of her had once been unthinkable. Years earlier she had promised herself she would never make this call, partly out of pride and partly out of loyalty to Brandon. But loyalty meant nothing now. The sun had barely risen when Emma dialed a number she had memorized long ago. The phone rang twice before a calm, familiar voice answered. Vincent Ashford spoke her name as if he had been expecting the call for days. Emma closed her eyes briefly when she heard his voice, feeling a mixture of relief and shame wash through her chest. Vincent had warned her about Brandon years ago when she first entered the syndicate world. He had seen the hunger in Brandon's ambition and the dangerous vanity behind his charm. Emma had ignored the warning then because she believed love and partnership would shape Brandon into something stronger. Now she understood how wrong she had been. Vincent did not ask for explanations. He already knew enough. His network of informants had watched the public scandal unfold inside the Syndicate Council Hall, and the news had spread through the underworld with astonishing speed. When Emma finally spoke, she did not beg or plead. She simply told him the truth. She had lost everything, and she needed help. The silence on the other end of the line lasted only a few seconds before. Vincent replied in the same calm tone he had always used when discussing serious matters. He told her to come to his office the following morning. There was work to do. After the call ended, Emma sat quietly in the dim light of the hotel room, her hand resting against the gentle curve of her stomach. Somewhere inside her, the tiny heartbeat of the child she carried continued without fear or doubt. For the first time since the night of her exile, Emma felt something other than pain rising inside her chest. It was not anger exactly, though anger lived there too. It was something colder and more precise. A plan had begun forming. Brandon Coletti believed he had erased her from the empire she built. What he did not understand yet was that Emma Hartwell had never needed his permission to rebuild a throne. Asterisk. The Ashford Tower rose above the east side of Manhattan, like a monument to quiet power. Unlike the flashy glass skyscrapers that surrounded it, the building carried a sense of age and authority that felt almost deliberate, as if it had been designed to remind anyone who entered that true influence rarely needed to announce itself. Emma stepped out of the black sedan that had collected her from Queens and looked up at the structure with calm eyes. Though the weight of everything that had happened during the past weeks pressed heavily against her chest, she had not seen Vincent Ashford in nearly 6 years. The last time they spoke had been during a private dinner where he warned her, with unsettling clarity, that Brandon Coletti's ambition would eventually outgrow his loyalty. Emma had defended Brandon fiercely that night, convinced that Vincent misunderstood the man she loved. Now, standing beneath the shadow of Ashford Tower, Emma felt the bitter irony of that memory. The lobby doors opened silently as she approached, revealing polished marble floors and a quiet staff that moved with the disciplined precision of people who understood they served something larger than themselves. Vincent Ashford waited for her on the top floor, seated behind a wide mahogany desk that faced a wall of windows overlooking the river. Age had turned his hair completely silver, but his eyes remained sharp and calculating. The same eyes that had once built financial empires and dismantled rival syndicates without raising his voice.
If you enjoyed this story and want to watch the full version, you can continue it on my Patreon. On Patreon, you will find the complete story and many more exclusive stories, including alpha, mafia, and romance dramas. If you love deep emotional stories, powerful characters, and dramatic relationships, Patreon is where I share the full experience. Visit my Patreon to unlock the full story and support the channel. The Patreon link is available in the video description below.